Imagine this scenario. You're working on your computer and you decide enough is enough. Let's take a wee break and head to a friend's house. You leave the computer on, lock up the house and head on out. A few hours later, you return to find a message. This message is from someone claiming to be from another time. In fact, it's from the 1500s, from someone that claimed to live on the land that your house is now built on. What would you think? I mean, obviously, it would be a joke. Someone is on the wind up, right? But then what if I told you that this happened back in 1984? The computer you were using was an old BBC Micro, and it certainly wasn't connected to any form of internet. In fact, it wasn't connected to any kind of network at all. Hi folks, I'm Johnny, and welcome to The Oddest. A wee bit of housekeeping before we get into the video. As you're well aware, I'm a very small channel. At the time of recording, I have around 504 subscribers, which I'm actually very happy about. I often get comments and messages from people saying that I should have more subscribers. Of course, I agree. It's the goal of every YouTuber to grow their subscriber base and therefore the channel. But sadly, out of everyone that watches my content, 90.8% of you are not subscribed. So this is just a gentle reminder that to subscribe only takes a second. It's free and it just helps me to grow. Now, with that out the way, let's take a wee look at the mystery of the Dodleston messages. So where are we off to today then? Let's pop down to England, to a tiny wee village there called Dodleston. Dodleston sits within the county of Cheshire, and with a population of around 680 people, it's fairly close to the border between England and Wales. Ken Webster was born in the Lake District in 1955. He graduated from the University of Aberystwyth in 1976, where he then moved to the village of Dodleston. He had moved into a small cottage there called Meadow Cottage, situated at the corner of Kinnerton and Church Road. This is an old farm building that was converted into smaller houses and flats. In 1984, Ken Webster was a teacher at Hardin High School, which was just across the border in Wales, a short 20-minute drive from Meadow Cottage. At the time, the UK government was pushing to bring modern technology into schools as they believed that computing was the future. Hardin High School was part of this initiative, and thanks to Margaret Thatcher's government, Acorn computers were pushed into the British curriculum. The BBC conjoined with Acorn to create a state-of-the-art computer built for this purpose, called the BBC Micro. Hardin was set up with enough of these computers that the teachers were able to take the computers home to help familiarise them with the system, and in turn they could develop lesson plans based around it. Ken was one of those teachers. He was able to take the hefty computer back to Meadow Cottage for this exact reason. Living with Ken at the time was his girlfriend Debbie, who was 10 years his junior, and a friend called Nick. Although the cottage was considered to be a two-bedroom property, one of the upstairs rooms was a studio, whilst the other remained as a master bedroom, the latter being reserved for Ken and Debbie, whilst Nick lived in the studio. Besides Ken being able to use the computer for school-related stuff, it was also there so that Nick could use it to work on some English performance projects. This was done by using an inbuilt word processor called Edward. Edward was a chip installed into one of the computer expansion ports. This was mainly rolled out as a standard to all school-bound BBC Micros in order to facilitate the pupils' learning word processing, to give them an edge and skills that they would no doubt encounter in the near future. However, thanks to Edward, the residents of Meadow Cottage would encounter something that no one was expecting. So we're talking about a very early iteration of a word processor with limited capabilities. Like most modern day word processors, upon completing your written work, Edward will save the document upon exit. So that's essentially it. You write what you need to write and it saves it to the hard drive. You then start the computer up again, open Edward and the document, and off you go. No internet, no cloud saves, no flash drives or any of that. In December of 1984, Ken, Debbie and Nick all headed out to a friend's house, David Lovell. He lived not too far away, and as such it was a short walk there and back. Prior to leaving the house, they decided to leave the computer switched on, albeit at the boot screen. They then locked the door and headed off. A few hours later, they would return to the cottage. Ken glanced at the computer screen and decided to have a wee look at Nick's English work. To do so, he would type the word index, thus displaying the saved documents on the computer. Only when he did this, there was a file that was not there before. This file was named KDN. Ken opened the file, and this is what he discovered.
Ken, Deb, Nick, true are the nightmares of a person that fears. Safe are the bodies of the silent world. Turn pretty flower, turn toward the sun. For you shall grow and so, but the flower reaches too high and withers in the burning light. Get out your bricks. Pussycat, pussycat, went to London to seek fame and fortune. Faith must not be lost, for this will be your redeemer.
As this was something Nick clearly had not created, the trio agreed that this was nothing more than a prank perpetrated by a mutual friend called John. John would occasionally pop round to the cottage to record guitar music with Ken. Although it was clearly a prank, Ken couldn't help but feel a little freaked out by this. The computer was returned to the high school. Another would not be loaned from the school again until February of 1985. One evening it was accidentally left on, and as before, a new file magically appeared on the system's hard drive. This time the ominous document was titled Reate, which could be construed as the word create, just missing the letter C. They opened the file.
I write on behalf of many. What strange words thou speak. Although I must confess that I hath also been ill-schooled, sometimes methinks alterations are somewhat baleful, for they break many a sleep in mine bed. Thou art goodly a man who hath fanciful woman who dwell in mine home. I hath no want to affray, for only since mine half-witted antic adrift at mine bound hath I been wreathed a night. I hath seen many alterations, last he charge house and thou home. 'Tis a fitting place, with lights which devil maketh, and costly things, that only mine friend Edmund Grey can afford. Or the king himself, 'twas a great crime to hate bribed mine house. L.W.
From what I can decipher from the text, it sounded like whoever L.W. was, he admired the house as it now stood. Although having electric lights are clearly the work of the devil, he also made comment of Debbie being a fanciful woman. By the phrase, I hath no want to affray, this could possibly mean that he didn't want to fight, argue, or cause offence. Whatever was meant by this lengthy message, one thing was clear. Ken and his friends were in his home, not the other way around. In the staff room at the high school, Ken would talk to other faculty members about the goings-on with the computer he had taken home, perhaps in the hopes that similar events had happened to one of them, and some light may be shone on this mystery. No one had. Most of his colleagues simply told him not to worry. Someone was clearly playing a prank on him. Or, worse still, someone was breaking into the house to leave these cryptic messages. However, the English teacher, Peter Trinder, had a different idea. See, Peter was curious because the words fit perfectly with 16th century Old English. Soon the mystery was discussed in certain circles, and a chap from the village called John Cummins developed an interest. John was a solicitor working out of London. He came up with an idea and approached Ken. His idea was simple. Let's reply and see what we get back. So Ken, Peter and John got to work. As Peter had mentioned before, it could seem that L.W. wrote in a 16th or 17th century dialect, so with that in mind, they got to writing. In the reign of Queen Elizabeth II, Dear L.W., thank you for your message. We are sorry for disturbing you. What would you like us to do? Did you live in a house on this land in about 1620? Do you want us to tell you more about our time? Why write a poem? Who is Edward Grey? Is he related to the Egerton family? Do you have a family? Is the King James or Charles Stuart? What is the charge house? Was this village called Dodleston in your time? And how many families lived here? Thank you very much for your messages. Thank you for not making us afraid. Ken, Debbie and John. Leaving the message displayed on the screen, the trio left the cottage and headed to the Red Lion pub, excited and nervous but ultimately hopeful that they would receive some sort of reply. Then, later that afternoon,
"'Twas an honest farm of oak and stone. It is helpful that you should tell me about thy time, just thou hath horse. Edmund Grey, brother of John Grey, live at Kinnerton Hall. Thy king, of course, is Henry the VIII, who is 46. I know what of King James. Mine charge house is a place of law, schooling. L.W. 28th of March anno 1521.
As strange and mysterious as this all was, if they were really having a conversation with someone from the year 1521, there were a few discrepancies that didn't add up. For example, Henry VIII was only 30 years old then, not 46 as LW had suggested. Ken felt he didn't want to call out LW on this, at least not for now, not until he knew more about what was going on. It could well have been some sort of prankster, or as it had been suggested before, someone could be breaking into the house. The other alternative, it was really someone from the past. Further confusing things were the strange use of modern grammar, brackets and question marks. This was now a full-time project. No longer was the BBC Micro used for schoolwork, no chance. We need to get to the bottom of this one, lads. Let's see what happens next. I mean, it couldn't get any weirder, right? In the next message, there was more information volunteered by LW. This mysterious time traveller's house had red stone footings, and that he was to sow barley early for ale, and that he needed to go to Nantwich to visit a farming friend, Richard Wishall. LW seemed keen to make it clear that Ken and co were trespassing in his house. This time, however, he signed off with the name Lucas. Could this be the initial L stands for in LW? Indeed it was, and in subsequent messages he revealed his full name to be Lucas Wainman. All of the information garnered from Lucas over several messages, although unexpected, it yielded more evidence to sort through. The more information Ken got, the more he can poke holes in this supposed prank. For example, the name Richard Wishall had been surrendered. This could give a point of investigation. They could endeavour to find out if indeed Wishall existed and garner a better picture of the time. Also, it seemed clear now that the land in which Meadow Cottage now sat on would be one and the same, and that Lucas occupied this land some 464 years earlier. Further investigation into the foundations of Meadow Cottage revealed red stone footings. The most compelling evidence so far, though, would come from fellow teacher Peter Trinder, who had been recording Lucas's words and doing a bit of digging himself. He was able to tie his words, sentence construction and distinct combination of words with the use of Latin that could be pinpointed back to the 16th century Cheshire. Some of the earlier inconsistencies had been corrected by themselves during more conversations with Lucas. He had revealed that he was living during the time of Henry VIII's marriage to Catherine Parr, which is sometime between 1543 and 1547. He had also claimed to have studied and been expelled from Brasenose College in Oxford. When Ken had written back and informed this would-be time traveller that he was writing to him from 1985, this seemed to make things even more bizarre.
You said your time be 1985. Methought you were alls from 2109, like your friend whom didst bring, Lean's boy's prey.
So it would seem that Ken wasn't the only one talking to Lucas. By his claims, he was also speaking to someone from the year 2109, and this person had paid Lucas a visit and brought him a Leam's Boist. Translated, this means box of light. Ken decided to reach out to 2109 with a simple message.
David, John. David, you interfere with communication. Next time you decide to perform your little experiment, you must be clear from here. We suggest you try someone else to sit with Debbie. Yes, we are what you would call a Dacian universe, but your understanding is incorrect. We ask nothing more of you than to carry on as you would prefer. We will have John present if given a choice, or you may bring another as mentioned. No, it is no concern to us that this is not proved. We will give you a plotting of a star next time. We move at a speed so that we cover every point in your time and universe. We have no form, we feed off a neat energy that you will not have heard of. 2109.
So it would seem now that the mystery had taken on a new form. This message would have you believe that it was sent from the future. So as I understand it, the entity calling themselves 2109 somehow managed to travel to the 1500s and meet with Lucas. I'll bet that was a shock for him, eh? They then left him with some sort of box of light that I can only assume was a communication device that would allow him to communicate with Ken, Debbie and now Peter, as Nick had since moved out of the cottage. I've got so many questions. I feel I need to mention also that during this whole time there had been a ton of paranormal activity occurring in the cottage. Tins would mysteriously stack themselves up in the kitchen in a manner that would seem impossible for any person to do. Mysterious chalk markings would appear on the kitchen floor. Footsteps could be heard throughout the cottage and bare footprints would materialise on kitchen worktops and surfaces. Debbie would report that on the 15th of May she had dropped Ken off at the school for work and then drove back to the cottage. It was around 9 AM. It was not until she walked up the path to the front door that she was overcome by an ominous feeling. She made note of the two house cats that were sitting on the garden wall watching her. Normally they would see her coming up the path and be circling around her feet. She popped her key in the lock and turned the handle. Once inside the living room she came face to face with a 6-foot high pile of furniture. She did the sensible thing and said, "Nope," about turned and got the heck out of there. That is a smart lassie. So if we were to assume that the spooky paranormal goings on were directly linked to the mystery on the BBC computer, things seemed to be taking a more sinister turn. A short time later, Debbie started to look into ley lines. So what are ley lines? Ley lines are straight alignments drawn between certain historic structures and landmarks. It's believed that certain energies manifest along these ley lines, and in the past, strange occurrences, paranormal activity, and spiritual experiences occur on these lines and are said to be more powerful where the lines cross. Debbie discovered that one such line ran right through the location of Meadow Cottage. After all this, Debbie started to have strange dreams about Lucas, in which she would see him and even interact with him. Peter and Ken reached out to the Society for Psychical Research for assistance on this matter. The SPR responded and sent Dave Welsh and John Bucknell to investigate. Once there, they proposed a test where the SPR guys would be left alone and out of sight of Ken and the others. In secret, Bucknell and Welsh would write 10 questions for the attention of 2109 and then delete them. This was on the condition that should a reply come, Ken or Debbie would contact them immediately. After a few days, they got a reply.
David, John. David, you interfere with communication. Next time you decide to perform your little experiment, you must be clear from here. We suggest you try someone else to sit with Debbie. Yes, we are what you would call a Dacian universe, but your understanding is incorrect. We ask nothing more of you than to carry on as you would prefer. We will have John present if given a choice, or you may bring another as mentioned. No, it is no concern to us that this is not proved. We will give you a plotting of a star next time. We move at a speed so that we cover every point in your time and universe. We have no form, we feed off a neat energy that you will not have heard of. 2109.
On hearing this, David Welsh responded. 2109 had not answered the questions, but it seemed that they had picked up all the questions left for them in the same order. Finally, it would appear that Ken, Debbie and Peter had proof. They had been completely shut out of the test, making it impossible for any of them to be blamed for perpetrating a hoax. Well, that's not exactly what happened. The SPR reported that there could have been sensitive microphones planted in the room with them, and although John and David never spoke about the questions or read them aloud, they deduced that such microphones would be able to pick up the sound of their fingers pressing the keys on the keyboard, therefore allowing Ken and crew to work out what had been typed. No chance. Come on, that's a bit of a reach, even more so than a time-travelling Word document. It had also been suggested that someone had been sending data through the earth wire of the electricity supply. Jeez. In any case, shortly after this investigation, Ken and Peter reached out to the SPR to see if they could get a copy of the case notes, but the Society for Psychical Research claimed that John Bucknell wasn't with the SPR, and Dave Welsh, he had vanished. More to the point, there was no records of any investigation taking place at Meadow Cottage. In total, there were over 150 messages sent between LW and Ken. In later messages, Lucas revealed that he had used a fake name due to fear of ridicule or reprisals. He actually said his real name was Thomas Hardin. This turned out to be a very crucial piece of information. This name can be traced back to the 1530s, where one of the founding fellows was a chap by the name of Thomas Hardin. Of course, these days researching such a thing takes nothing more than a few Google searches and a wee click here or there. But back in 1985, it required Peter travelling to Oxford to delve through official records there. Shortly after all this, 2109 would send a message to them. This time, it contained a name and a telephone number for them to call. The guy was a UFO expert called Gary Rowe.
You may phone him at the number below and invite him to talk with you. When he comes, show him this and ask him what he makes of it. Peter must do the telephoning. Tell him that you got this telephone number from a UFO enthusiast. 2109.
They reached out to Gary, and to their surprise they got him. He was more than keen to assist them with a follow-up investigation. He arrived at the cottage a short time later, armed with a bunch of equipment, computer-linked sensors and other types of computery stuff. What? Computery is a word? Isn't it? Once Gary was at the cottage and sat in front of the BBC Micro, he got to work and soon was having full conversations with 2109. Ken later described Gary as a smart, intelligent man that was very knowledgeable in his field. 2109 wrote messages to Gary via Ken, asking him to print off the messages and place them in a sealed envelope, messages that he was instructed not to read. This strange request prompted Gary to send the following message. Greetings. I'm instructed to apologise, but in any event, I would have done so of my own volition. There will be a letter hopefully this weekend. I am also instructed to apologise to Ken and Debbie. I must try and answer your last letter. It would appear that you are more important than I had realised in the scheme of things. Gary. However, just like John Welsh, Gary seemed to simply vanish. Ken would later describe this as strange, but more so frustrating, purely because this didn't bring them any closer to solving this riddle. One of the messages from Thomas Hardin explained exactly how he came by his means of communication. The following was translated by Peter Trinder into a modern dialect.
I never feared for my soul so much in my life. But so afraid was I that I couldn't move away from this strange messenger. He said, "Fear not, good Thomas. You are starred to be a great man. If you do not have fear but keep your faith strong, then after other words, which I do confess were not like devil talk, he was gone, leaving the leaves, which appeared to be the same as your computer.
Thomas would go on to explain that when he spoke to the leaves, that words would appear on it automatically. How Thomas received messages back, however, proved to have its own issues. It's definitely strange that this type of obvious information came late in this insane, let's face it, unbelievable journey. Thomas would sign off with a promise. He promised that he would write a book on this fantastic journey in order for future generations to find.
One day you will all sit down at my table for wine and meat by the river in Oxford, where we shall read each other's books and laugh. We shall speak of truth and good men, watching Oxford change together forevermore. In your time my book is old, but I shall not go to my God until it is written that we will all be truly embraced. My love to you all. I shall await you in Oxford. Thomas Hardin.
There was also a final message from 2109.
There is another person to come. They will be the help we need. You will know them when they come. Thomas did eventually write his book and soon died. Shortly after, he placed it in a secure place. It shouldn't take too many years to find it. Though he wrote it in Latin with the help of a friend that he met in Oxford. The inscription reads, "Me writes this in the hope that mine fellows will one day find this book. Then may our lands be not so distant."
So for now, that's this wee mystery wrapping up to an end. But as you can see, there was a final piece to this puzzle, the secret book that Hardin wrote. If this book were to be uncovered, not only would it be a fantastic record of time travel as told from the 1500s, but it would also prove without a doubt that this entire journey was in fact the truth. In 1989, Ken Webster wrote and published a book detailing the events that went down at Meadow Cottage in 1985. See, for me, it doesn't seem like this was a stunt perpetrated for money or fame. It would take 4 years for Ken to write the book, and even then it flew under the radar. At the end of the book, there was a wee section written by Peter Trinder, and this is probably the most compelling. He goes into detail, explaining that he had to go to great lengths researching everything as it was happening, like the words and dialect that Thomas Hardin was using in the messages. In his overall opinion, this simply could not have been a hoax. And in a 1996 episode of the TV show Out of This World, he would appear on camera to say this publicly.
If somebody was doing this as a hoax, they would have had to do one hell of a lot of research to organise this. All right, it could have been done. Somebody spent a long time doing this in advance. But what for?
Although there were elements of the show that drew scepticism on the whole thing.
Looking at the verb structure, there are things which Lucas says that would not have been said in 1546. It's true that individuals can make up individual words, but we don't make up our verbs. It's possible, or it was possible in England in 1546 to say I do, thou dost, he, she or it doth, he, she or it does. But it wasn't possible to say I doth, or he, she or it dost. Now, all the way through Lucas's messages, he mixes and messes up these suffixes with the wrong subject.
Do you think it's some kind of hoax or forgery?
Well, it's certainly, if it's meant to look like early modern English writing, it doesn't even look close.
So do you think it's a sophisticated hoax by somebody who has a background in modern English?
No, if somebody had a background in early modern English writings, their hoax would look a lot better than this. I mean, they would get their verbal inflections correct. They wouldn't choose vocabulary that came from a period long before the period that this is supposed to have been written in. They'd do it a lot better.
Well, if it were me, of course, yes, it would have been done. But I would know. There would be no point in the whole thing. I can honestly say it wasn't me. I mean, but you believe or you don't believe. I knew that it wasn't me, and I did not believe that it could be Ken. Of course, always from the start. That was the assumption I started with when he first gave me this strange piece of paper over the school dinner table one day and said, "Do you understand this?" And I said, "Well, let me take it home and have a look at it," knowing I got the dictionary. And I thought, well, now, this dictionary will soon prove that this is a bit of silly nonsense. But of course it didn't.
Ken and Debbie also appeared on the show, but opted not to show their faces. Gary Rowe, the investigator in the latter part of this mystery, would reappear years later and make comments on internet forums about the Dodleston case. I had the opportunity to investigate these happenings firsthand. No, I am not some away with the fairies wishful believer. I investigated with professional detachment, not bothered what I would find, fake or fact. I left no stone unturned and used cutting-edge science to get to the truth. In fact, I believe it was the first computer-controlled psychic investigation recorded in the world. I don't care two hoots if nobody ever believes it. I know it really happened. It changed my life forever. It's going to change yours. The book should or will one day be ISBN recoded in the history section. It is a monumental historical marker in the ribbon of time. So what's to be made of this fantastic, thought-provoking mystery? Did it really happen? Was it just some elaborate hoax perpetrated by Ken, Debbie or Peter? Or perhaps all three? Bearing in mind that, as with most mysterious paranormal cases, we're really only taking it at face value, the claims of supposed witnesses. For me, there are various possibilities. It could be all true. A mysterious entity from the far-off future chose the 1500s and a chap called Thomas Hardin to deliver a light box in which he could communicate with someone from 1985. It could be some form of paranormal event, possession, a poltergeist, or another form of psychic communication, as Gary Rowe had suggested. The theory that I like is that time is not linear. Some of the world's leading scientists firmly believe in the multiverse, and at certain points in space and time, these lines may cross, causing certain events to manifest. Or, and this one is most likely, it was all just a big hoax.
It was very real. That's all I'm saying, Richard. It was very close. The kind of thing that you could not doubt. But all the time one was aware of the possibility of hoax. But if it was a hoax, by golly, it was brilliant.
However, there are still a few elements that certainly would raise eyebrows. The fact that LW became Thomas Hardin, coincidentally sharing the same name as the high school and village that Thomas and Ken taught at, seems to be a bit on the nose, a wee bit too convenient. But then saying that, back in medieval England, prior to surnames being adopted, people were referred to as their first names, and then where they lived or hailed from. In this case, it could well have been Thomas of Hardin. What's your thoughts on this then? I mean, it's a fantastic story, and one of my favourites for sure. If you've gotten this far and stuck with me on this journey, then I sincerely thank you. Your support in watching my channel means the world to me. So, until next time, stay safe out there, and remember, keep smiling.